Today I'm going to show you how to migrate from our legacy cluster management tool MemSQL Ops to our new management tool MemSQL Tools. Here I'm logged into an instance where I have a cluster with a master aggregator and a leaf. I'm going to show you what this cluster looks like by running MemSQL Ops MemSQL list. Great, as you can see I have two nodes. They're running on the same host, but you can also do this when you have remote hosts that house nodes as well. The first step of this process is to copy the command to install MemSQL packages, MemSQL Tools packages, which include MemSQL Toolbox and MemSQL Client. Now I've already added the repository to this instance here, so I'm just going to run the install command. This might take a second. Looks like it's almost complete here. Great, looks like that worked, and now the next step is to enable what's called cluster manual control on this cluster. So MemSQL Ops has operations that complete automatically. For example, it might restart a node that failed or do things under the hood without being commanded to do so. So what we're telling it for the purpose of this migration is not to do anything unless automatically unless commanded. And this is what MemSQL Ops Cluster Manual Control does. And as you can see, it gives you a little warning that indicates that what might happen while you're running in manual control. Great. Now the next step is to add a license key. And you might be wondering, well, I already have a license key applied to this cluster. Why do I need to add another one? Well, we've changed our licensing system and we've upgraded our licensing in general. These licenses that are compatible with MemSQL Tools are more secure, robust, and they're easier to apply. And you can get them from the customer portal as well. I will copy mine in a moment, and you can see what the new licenses look like. Great. It looks like the license was successfully added. Now the next step is going to be to create a YAML file that represents our cluster. If you are familiar with MemSQL Tools already, you might know that there's one way to deploy MemSQL Tools and install MemSQL is by using a YAML configuration file. Essentially, the YAML file contains the configurations that represent what your cluster looks like, including node, host, and certain variable configurations. So essentially, this command that we're going to run is going to create that file for these hosts and nodes that we have here. And that command is MemSQL Ops Migration Setup. As you can see, this created a file in the YAML format, and that's what we're going to use in the next step to actually deploy the cluster. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to replace cluster file here with this directory right here. And it's going to ask me for a root password, which is the password that I used to initially install the database with. Great. Looks like it worked successfully, and it's going to give me a list of actions that it's going to take in order to register the cluster with MemSQL Tools. So I'm going to hit yes. Great, we're all set. So essentially it went through the process of registering all the hosts with MemSQL Tools, creating the nodes, adding the leaves, and it gives you the final state of the cluster, which you can see on the screen here. So this is great because this means we have the process that actually migrated our cluster over, and the next step are going to be to restart the cluster and make sure everything looks okay. So let's first run the command MemSQL Toolbox config list hosts. Now this tells you all the hosts that are registered. So as you can see, we have one host, which is localhost here, and it looks good. And we also want to check the nodes as well to make sure that both the nodes are properly registered with tools. And it looks like they are. We have two nodes, a master and a leaf. So the next thing we're going to do is restart our nodes. If you have multiple leaves and can benefit from high availability, what's great is you do not have to take downtime during this process. You can use the online option. It's a flag with the restart cluster button that you can add. And what it'll do is it'll restart nodes one availability group at a time. You don't have to go offline at all for this. But because I only have a master and a leaf and I can't benefit from high availability, I'm just simply going to run a regular restart. And again, if you wanted to do this online and you're benefiting from high availability, you just add the argument -- online. And this might take a second. Great, that completed successfully. I'm going to do one more sanity check to make sure everything is properly showing up still, just by running MemSQL admin list nodes. Note that MemSQL admin list nodes is like a comparison to MemSQL Ops MemSQL list. This is excellent. We now have MemSQL Tools monitoring the cluster, and in fact, we also have MemSQL Ops monitoring the cluster. So now we're going to take the steps to actually remove MemSQL Ops from the cluster as well. So again, let's go back to Ops here and run MemSQL Ops MemSQL list. As you can see, Ops is still monitoring the cluster. The first thing we're going to do is run a command called unmonitor. Now, if you're familiar with the Ops architecture, you know that Ops has a concept of what's called agents. Agents sit on each node of the cluster. MemSQL Tools does not have agents, but what the command unmonitor allows you to do is unmonitor specific nodes across your cluster. So I'm going to run the command. The command takes in an ID. So I am going to input the ID next to it from the ID column here. So I'm going to first unmonitor the master. Great. And it tells me that it's no longer monitoring that node. I'm going to run the same command to unmonitor the leaf node. And again, you're pasting the ID from the output of MemSQL list. And here it prompts you, would you additionally like to remove the leaf node from MemSQL cluster? And we definitely don't want to do that, so I'm going to be saying no. And now our cluster is no longer being monitored by Ops. So let's just double check this. MemSQL Ops MemSQL list again. No MemSQL nodes are found, which is exactly what we wanted to do. Now, for the purpose of cleaning up your system, we recommend that you also remove MemSQL Ops entirely. So with that command, you're going to use agent uninstall and uninstall ops all, which means we're going to uninstall all the agents across the cluster. And again, this warns you because in most scenarios in a production cluster, you likely don't want to delete MemSQL Ops. Now that our cluster is being managed by MemSQL Tools, we can do almost everything that we did in Ops with Tools. And note this isn't deleting any MemSQL data, it's simply deleting everything associated to MemSQL Ops. Great. Looks like it's successfully uninstalled. Now let's go back to our cluster and double check that we're still up and running with Tools. Looks like everything is good here. So you've just seen me install MemSQL Tools on this existing cluster that's being managed by Ops, use setup cluster with a cluster file to make Tools create a template and of this cluster and manage it with tools and remove ops entirely. So now you're all set up with MemSQL Tools. Make sure to check out all the new features of tools and test them out, like MemSQL Report. Thank you for watching, and we hope you can use this video to migrate from ops to tools.